Welcome back to This Week in Creationism, episode number 15. I'm your host, Joel Duff, and here I take a look at the recent headlines in creationism over the past week. This week we have Purging Mutations, Evolution Universal, Stalactites, yes, back to stalactites, Snowflakes, quote mining, and several other stories. Let's start out with a couple Ken Ham Facebook posts. Here we have Ken Ham touting the fact that the Ark Encounter has received yet another award, in this case from the Kentucky Travel Industry Association for their ad campaign using their animated giraffes. They've received quite a number of awards, mostly from Christian organizations, but they've also received awards from several secular organizations as well. In this case, the Kentucky Travel Industry is acknowledging their advertising campaign and also, in a way, acknowledging the fact that that campaign has resulted in bringing in a lot of people to the state of Kentucky, to the Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter. And I know that there are some that would say that he hasn't fulfilled his promises to the state with respect to bringing in the millions and millions that were touted. But nonetheless, I mean, hundreds of thousands of people come to the Ark and the Creation Museum, and it certainly has brought in millions of dollars to the state of Kentucky. Um, there is, I visited the Ark Encounter just a couple of weeks ago. I have yet to sort of put together some of my pictures, and I thought I would take you on a little tour of the grounds and talk about some of the things I observed there, because I was there for a creation college expo thing. So I want to talk about that some. And the grounds really are world class. I mean, it's extremely well done. I mean, I can understand as I listen to people talk, about being there, that they feel like they're at a theme park that is on par with other major theme parks around the country. Now, I'm not going to vouch for the the validity of the displays that are inside of the Ark. But with respect to it being a family-friendly environment and a place that people enjoy being, I can't say that they're not successful at having produced such a thing. And I expect that they will continue to be able to bring quite a number of people in, even if it's not on par with the I guess you could say the high expectations when it originally opened. Nonetheless, nothing wrong with Ken Ham touting the fact that they've won a variety of awards. I mean, that's what any spokesperson should do for any museum in any place. Is they're going to talk about that they've been acknowledged, and that's a way of hoping to get more people to come. Now, on a more serious note, Ken Ham is always promoting the various articles that are published on AnswersInGenesis.com, and here he is referencing a short blog post on Answers in Genesis, which we're not going to look at, but I'm just going to bring it to your attention because I thought it was kind of interesting. He's referencing a New Scientist article that actually proposes that on any planet and really any place in the universe, you would expect the process of natural selection to occur. Natural selection, not necessarily involving DNA, but any kind of information system or any kind of molecules that are selected by the environment and have the ability to be able to, when the environment selects between molecules or even atoms that function better under one condition versus another, that would be a form of natural selection, right? Natural just being the environmental conditions, rewards certain kinds of chemical reactions or interactions of different types of things, all right, with each other. And I think that's all that New Scientist article is arguing, is that natural selection is a universal phenomenon in the sense that just the way that the just the way that nature functions in terms of the laws that guide and govern our universe, the natural result is that a process like natural selection could be expected to happen really anywhere and everywhere in the universe. I don't think there's really anything too shocking about that, especially since Ken Ham and Answers in Genesis believe that natural selection is a real process. Now, you could go back and ask the question, what about in the Garden of Eden? Before there was, before the fall, and there was in their mind before perfection was broken, right? Was there in the original creation a form of natural selection? And in fact, you know, many younger creationists would say yes. I mean, it is a phenomena that happens because honestly, when you start to really think about it, if you just go beyond some really simple concept and you start to actually work out what happened, what would happen in a situation where you have variation, and younger creationists certainly think that there was variation created in the original creation, right? Because they're always talking about, packed in variation into the various kinds that then is exploited and turned into all the different types of species that we have today. Once you have variation, you have natural selection. It just happens because it happens. All right. I know that's not a very satisfying way of putting it, but we've discussed this in many other places and other times. Anyway, it's uh, the wording for natural selection. It's interesting. They have a kind of a love-hate relationship with natural selection, right? Natural selection happens, and they actually use it as a mechanism to explain how a couple animals on the ark could have turned into or diversified into hundreds of species, and they'll invoke the process of natural selection to do that. And they'll invoke the process of natural selection to change species, change the individual created kinds into a variety of different variations of those kinds, even prior to the flood. And as I said before, some creationists would say that even if Adam hadn't sinned, there would have been different environments in the world. And if there's different environments and you have multiple different copies, all right, multiple different individuals in a population that express variation, in different environments, God would have created different individuals to work better in different environments. Those environments are going to select for the characteristics that best fit in that environment. I mean, that's natural. That's natural selection. And so it's interesting that as you talk about natural selection, and you can try to deny natural selection happens until you really start to think about what's happening, and it's like, oh yeah, well okay, natural selection happens there. Oh yeah, that does happen over there, and you end up saying it happens all the time everywhere. It's hard not to have natural selection to happen. It's hard to imagine a scenario in which natural selection isn't actually a process in action and functioning in a world. But spent too much time on this. Let's move on. Genetic mutations can be purged from the genome. A somewhat longer article on Answers in Genesis this past week, on December 1st. Hey, it's by our friend Harry F. Sanders, who we've talked about before. Whoops, it's the third. Who have said is clearly a pseudonym, a person writing underneath a pseudonym, and he's written a lot of articles for Answers in Genesis. This is kind of a repetitious thing. It's the same old story. Trying to talk about how inbreeding can't purge enough of the mutations from a genome that won't stop genetic entropy. Just completely doesn't even I won't even say he dismisses other ideas of how mutations are removed from genomes over time. He just simply doesn't discuss other mechanisms, and he just concludes that inbreeding isn't sufficient. Yeah, inbreeding by itself isn't going to be sufficient to explain all of the removal of detrimental mutations in a population. There's other mechanisms for doing it as well, and it's a combination approach in that. At the end of the day, what's happening here is that he's starting with, and this is typical for Answers in Genesis, they're starting with a perfect genome, an assumption that the original genome had variation, but those variations, every single variation was good for the organism. And then any change to that organism as a mutation can't improve that organism, but it must only tear that organism down. Genetic entropy. Characteristics are lost, characteristics are mangled, right, by mutations. And therefore, for populations to survive over the long run, over long periods of time, they must get rid of these negative mutations and somehow purify themselves. Of course, in their minds, they can never be purified because they can never return to the perfect state, right? And so that's why it's easy for them to see a genome as never getting better, but only getting worse. Um, but they start from a starting point that's basically an unproven starting point, and it's an assumption, and really the data doesn't bear out the fact that populations can't purge their negative mutations over some periods of time. But we're not going to get into those mechanisms here because we've talked about a lot of those in the past. Oh, all right. So I was intrigued by creation.com, who had a highlighted article on their website this past week, speleotherm growth in caves versus man-made structures. And interestingly, this was a response a couple weeks ago on This Week in Creationism, I think episode number 13, maybe 12. I talked about the fact that they had an article that talked about caves, stalactites, and actually they had a basement from a building that had these stalactites that had formed, actually straws. Um, and they talked about how, they grew really, really fast. And so the implication is that when somebody tells you that the stalactite in a cave took 50,000 years to develop, well, if you look over here at this other cave, well, you can see that this grew really, really fast. And so therefore that could have also explained that data over there. It's really using the exception to prove the rule. Um, um, and so I wrote a response to that. I had responded to that. I talked about it on This Week in Creationism, but I also made a separate video, right? And that video was calthamites or straw stalactites. And I talked to how about what they're doing is they're doing an apples to oranges thing where they're comparing an apple and then they're looking at those oranges and they're trying to say they're the same thing. And therefore, all those problems that people think, say are problems with young Earth creationism, that they can't really squeeze cave formation into just 4,350 years. I was trying to point out that there is really a problem there, and you can't compare these apples and oranges. And somebody actually wrote to creation.com and asked essentially that question, is this an apples to oranges type of thing? And how can you explain it? And they go through a long, involved response to that. But the end result of all that response is they don't really answer that question. They go into something about cave formation a little bit. They have a whole bunch of chemistry in there, but it's still, it's using exceptional growth under specific conditions to try to explain the majority of cave formations and stalactites and stalagmites. But in those particular circumstances, the special circumstances that they have to go to try to get really extended fast growth aren't present in those cases. And they'll say, well, maybe they were present in the past or something like that. But it's not a natural explanation. It's still an explanation that says, here's this really rare case, and we're going to apply it to what looks like to be the normal case. We're going to say that every case is really rare and exceptional. And that's just not the obvious observation that you make from fossil from cave records. Younger creationists often like to tell their audience that all the evidence naturally points to a young Earth, and it clearly points to a young Earth. But then when you have to spend so much time making all kinds of exceptional rules, well, maybe this happened, but this could have happened, and this could have happened. These conditions could have been different in the past, and that would have combined to then create this. Once you have that kind of ad hoc assemblage of ideas that you have to pull together to then explain this unusual cave over here, it doesn't become the simplest story, the most obvious story, right? Because there's lots of ways you can look at caves in which the simplest explanation for the cave is That cave took a long time to form. There are some exceptional caves that have formed over much faster periods of time, but that's not the norm. And so, explaining away the norm is essentially what young Earth creationists are always faced with doing. Here's the obvious implications of what I'm looking at. And the obvious implications are, wow, that took a long time to do. So therefore, we're going to have to like find some exceptional rules and then hope that all those exceptions are always true. And that story gets a little old when you tell it hundreds of times, for hundreds of different kinds of things and phenomena. It's always the exception that one has to accept. It's kind of like conspiracy theories, right? And I'm not saying creationist is a conspiracy in the same sense, but um, there's always in the conspiracy theory, you have to throw out the normal data and the what's the obvious expectation, and you have to accept some hidden rules, you have to accept some assumptions, things you won't be able to prove, but are possible. And you add lots of individual possible things to make a story that says, this is possible. But possible is different than probable. For most conspiracies, is the conspiracy the most probable explanation for the data we have? Probably not, right? It's the exception. It's the highly exceptional, rare possibility, as opposed to the common explanation. I'm okay with sometimes the rare explanation, the exception, is the way history actually worked. But that's not, once in a while that happens. That can't be your explanation every single time. All right, and then on Interest in Genesis, we have this interesting article. Did a human ancestor walk like us, but climb like apes? And so their new paleontologist, Gabriella Haynes, she reviews a study of Australopithecus sabida. And if you're wondering what that's about, there was a very recent paper that um, talks about a fossil find in which Australopithecus sabida is a fossil that's already well known, but now they found a portion of the backbone, a little piece of the pelvis that was unknown before that. And in their analysis of that portion of the body, of the anatomy of this particular species, they decide that it supports upright walking, much more so than was already acknowledged as a possibility from other parts of the anatomy. On the other hand, Australopithecus sabida has very long arms, curved hands, and so forth, which would have been very good for climbing around in trees. And so that's where you get this idea that there is an extinct species of hominid-like animal that is walked around, could walk from tree to tree or across, a fairly large landscape in an upright position on feet that are more human-like, but also had hands that are like apes. And so, the obvious implication of that to a creationist is that that's what sounds like a intermediate fossil, right? And so in this particular article, Dr. Haynes spends a lot of time trying to downplay the evidence of walking upright and suggesting that it's not quite, that it doesn't have to be interpreted that way, and that this was more ape-like than is being suggested by this paper. And okay, I think she's wrong. It seems like fairly decent evidence that this particular species was able to walk fairly upright at times. And the question I have is, why get so upset about it? Now, I've already mentioned one reason to get upset about it is because it sounds like a sort of an intermediate creature, right? And that just, there's going to be an automatic reaction from the young Earth creationist audience that just can't be. And so it's easier to sort of like try to downplay that evidence and try to manipulate that evidence into no, that's not the case. Just like kind of Lucy is often like over accentuates the ape-like features of Lucy to try to make sure she seems really ape-like. So there isn't any question to make sure there's a large gulf between human beings and everything else. Well, human beings, Neanderthals, and the other extinct humans that are ancient humans. But finding the dividing line between ancient humans and others is kind of hard, especially if you have fossils like this, which seem kind of even more intermediate, and so that creates a problem. And so the simplest solution is to simply say there isn't a problem and ignore it. But I wonder why go through all that effort? Why not just take the simple solution, which is actually presented in the Creation Museum? Uh, and I don't see why it doesn't fit with the creation idea of kinds. And here it is. All right, and you've maybe seen me share this before, but this is an image of a display that's at the Creation Museum. Who are Lucy's relatives, the great apes? And this is Answers in Genesis. This is their, I'll call it hypothesis of the origin of the ape kind as separate from human beings. Here we have in the original creation, the creation of an original ape ancestor, right? The perfect ape ancestor. And then these dotted lines represent speculative changes in the ape ancestor, all right, after Adam and Eve, in which they diversified into a whole bunch of different varieties of apes. And I guess those varieties, maybe even species of apes. But of course, most of those species of apes came to their demise in Noah's flood. But Noah, preserving two of every kind of animal, right, would have brought two ape ancestors on the ark. And that's what they're showing here. They're showing like two of them survived through the ark, through this great, what really is a great extinction event, right? Because all these lines go extinct here. And so two representatives of the ape kind survive, and after the ark, they diversify through, hey, guess what? Natural selection we mentioned earlier, and other mechanisms, including even really quietly mutations as well. And so they diversify, and they diversify into the super large apes that are extinct, like Gigantopithecus. And then, of course, the orangutans, you have gorillas, you have chimps and bonobos, right? Those are the things we're familiar with as being the great apes that are living species today. And so all of those, according to, this is presented to the audience of anybody that goes into the Creation Museum, they're going to be able to see this. They're going to see that gorillas, orangutans, chimps, and bonobos are all the same kind of organism and evolved from a common ancestor, not just from the original creation, but a common ancestor on the ark just 4,000 years ago. But then look down here. This is what's interesting. Here's Ardipithecus. Here's Paranthropus. And then here we have Australopithecus, right? And then there's a couple different species, according to secular paleontologists, of Australopithecus. But one of those is the one we were just talking about. And of course, they're showing this as not walking upright. But there's a fair amount of evidence that Ardipithecus walked upright and Australopithecus walked upright. What's wrong with walking upright, I have to ask? Why couldn't, I mean, stick with me here. Think this through. Orangutans, gorillas, chimps, and bonobos are really different organisms, right? In my mind, they're quite different from each other. I don't know if you've gone to the zoo and stood in front of the gorilla cage and then gone over to the orangutans and then gone over to the chimps. And of course, there's similarities to them, just like there's similarities to us, right? But they're quite different from each other in behavior and anatomy and right and so forth, and habitat, how they climb, so forth. Why couldn't one of these things that have diversified, if that much diversity could come from just two individuals and they could become that different from one another, living in all these different environments, very different anatomical systems. Why couldn't two of them had been given by God the variation in the original kind that they could sort that variation into a slightly different hip and back structure, allowing them to walk upright? Because after all, I mean, Australopithecus and Ardipithecus have feet that are very similar to ours compared to chimps, gorillas, and bonobos. They had feet for walking upright. Angiogenesis could just, instead of constantly trying to manipulate the data to try to make it sound like they're not upright walking, because I think they're afraid their audience will think, oh, well, that's what makes you human, being able to walk upright. What makes us human about being able to walk upright? I mean, is that the image of God, being able to walk upright? Um, just have one of these walking upright, just like the paleontologists suggest they do, and just say it's a variant among these other ones. Now, I want to give credit to some of the, well, some of the new creationists, as I've called them, that are starting to acknowledge that this is actually probably the case, right? Well, and there's some confusion. Some creationists believe that some of these, like especially Australopithecus, that some of them, like the one we're just talking about here, might have actually been descendants of Adam and Eve, and so are not. They would say, no, these are not in this particular tree. They're not part of the great apes, but they're actually part of human beings. But that's where this separation becomes kind of difficult this week. So on creation.com, oh boy, a bunch of articles over there. They're pretty consistent about pumping like one new thing out a day, but it's, Thanksgiving was 2 weeks, a week and a half ago. And then because of Christmas coming up, what we're actually seeing is we're seeing a lot of just throwing out old material. So republishing things from a year ago, 2 years ago, taking something from one of their magazines and then republishing it again on the website. So there's always something fresh and new on the website, except it's not always new stuff. Now, some of these are new, and we're not gonna discuss all. Yeah, I'd say Snowball Earth. A lot of these have a similar theme, especially this one and even this one down here kind of have similar themes. They're kind of like, hey, look out there. Scientists are always changing their mind. They change the dates on things. They used to say that they thought that this happened, but now they're saying they were wrong, and now something else is happening. So, for example, the universe was billions of years, this number of billion years old, and there were certain planets that were like X billion years old. But now they've remeasured that and they find out that they're, 500 million years less old, or maybe 500 million years older. So that's a lot different. And the snowball Earth is kind of the same thing. Now they think that it wasn't exactly completely frozen over in the past. All these are, hey, scientists have proposed hypotheses. They have a little bit of data, and they've said, here's what we know now. And then they've collected more data and they refined their models. And I would say the models have gotten better because we have more data. And more data means it's okay to readjust things over time. But every time there's a readjustment, it's kind of like, oh, scientists are wrong. So therefore, I mean, and without saying it, or sometimes they even say it explicitly, but usually they don't say it. It's just kind of like, you can't trust, these secular science because they're always changing their minds about how old something is. But hey, we've always known the Earth was only 6,000 years old, and that never changes, right? And so, I don't think as many times as secular scientists change the age of the Earth, it's not going to shrink all the way down to 6,000 years at all. Okay, let's go over to Institute for Creation Research. New evidence of a flood in the Grand Canyon. Oh yeah, more stuff about the Coconino sandstone. It's the same old story there. There's really nothing new there. ICR is they've been doing their own dinosaur dig, and they have found little pieces of sauropod, and they're hoping that maybe they'll be able to get soft tissues out of them. So, stick around for, it's basically stick around and also donate so we can do this research. And then there's this story on snowflakes, and as you might imagine, hey, snowflakes are unique. Everyone's different, and only God could have made design snowflakes. Um, and I don't understand. I mean, I understand the idea of design that way, but what is design really? I mean, design is God ordaining the rules by which snowflakes are made, just like the rules for everything around me and how they operate. So really, everything is designed, right? So pointing out design as if it's like really special in a snowflake and is really no different than pointing out design in every single thing in the world, which makes them a whole lot less special. Hey, if you want to learn about snowflakes, great video by Veritasium just this last week that talks to a professor who studies snowflakes and actually shows how you can make two snowflakes that are the same, which actually makes sense because if God is a God of structure and of consistently in terms of how he upholds his laws by which the world around us work. Understanding those laws and being consistent with those laws should produce the same exact type of snowflake. And in fact, in that video, you can see him make multiple snowflakes that are virtually identical to your eye. And his point, of course, is also that every snowflake is different. That's true because every snowflake is made under different conditions. And slightly different conditions means you're going to have different outcomes. Not that they aren't still actually predictable because they're all governed by laws, but because you have multiple laws happening in because of slight variations in, say, temperature in two different locations, one snowflake being made over here and one being made over here, right? They're going to form differently because of that, different humidity, different temperatures. Um, and I love the point he makes in this video as well about the fact that, he says everyone gets excited about the fact that no two snowflakes are the same, as if that's something really special. He says, but really there are no two anything that are the same. He's absolutely right. I mean, I can't think of any two things that are identical to each other. We call things identical, like identical twins, but identical twins aren't identical to each other. I mean, even their DNA, which should be theoretically, you kind of think they should be identical, but of course they're not identical because there's mutations. And everything else is, there's going to be variation. And any two things can't be in exactly the same spot at one time. And because no two places are exactly identical in terms of the conditions, the environment, then those two things cannot be identical because they're going to have developed or changed within different environments, and the environment will sculpt them to, in some sense, into different things. So yeah, kind of whoop-de-doo. Snowflakes are different, but yeah, so are you and everything else. And um, you know, but snowflakes are still cool. All right, and this video is really awesome because it shows tons of different types of snowflakes and so forth. All right, I think we're getting close here. The oceans point to a young Earth. This one really got me because I've talked about the oceans and I've written about the oceans and salt levels in the ocean multiple times. So Tompkins and Clary, they join up to write yet another article about the oceans pointing to a young Earth. And I'm just highlighting let's just look at the highlights here. Sediment deposits on the bottom of the ocean aren't nearly thick enough to account for the rate they're being deposited today in the ocean crust if the ocean crust were hundreds of millions of years old. And then that third one there isn't nearly enough salt in the oceans if the Earth is billions of years old. And therefore, because of these three things, our oceans are a profound testimony to a young Earth. I don't know how many dozens of times that Christian scientists have written about these examples and how these are misconceptions and don't point to a young Earth at all. The salt in the ocean thing, I've written a multiple part series about that and the problems with that. But I can sum it up pretty quick, and that is, yes, they run through some data. They're like, here's the places where salt is lost. Here's the places where salt is gained, right? Because water is being put on the continents and then eroding the continents, which includes salt. And it goes into the ocean, and so therefore the ocean should be getting saltier and saltier. But of course, there are places where salt comes out of the ocean. But the one thing they always forget to mention is that they're assuming uniformitarianism. They're assuming that the salt is always coming in and it's building up, and that's going to happen in a relatively continuous way over long periods of time. Um, but you know, no person that believes in the old Earth is bound to a completely uniform way in which salt is added to the ocean. And so I don't see anything in this article that talks about the fact that there is more than a mile thick layer of salt underneath the Mediterranean Sea. Or what about the massive salt deposits under the Dead Sea? Or what about all the salt deposits up here in Michigan and other areas, and other associated precipitates? All right, there are times in history in which massive amounts of salt evaporated in various places and were deposited in the earth. That removes huge amounts of salt from the ocean. Um, and there are times in which the sea gets less salty because there's so much water bound up in ice, right? So as the ice from the ice caps melt, right, that adds fresh water to the ocean, which dilutes the ocean, making it less salty, right? And then during an ice age, when water is added to the ice caps, and then the oceans get lower, they're going to get much saltier. But of course, when they get much saltier, there are going to be places where that salt is going to precipitate out at higher rates than it does today, right? The rates at which salt is being added to the ocean and removed today are not constant over time. No person who believes the earth is old would say that it is constant over time. And yet they're assuming this constant nature in their argument. And the sediment at the bottom of the ocean, they do the same thing that I have said it. I know multiple other bloggers have said it. I know it's in multiple books about the age of the earth in which Christian scientists who have written on this topic have pointed out one of the big problems with this particular argument. Um, um, it's not even a misconception. It is a misrepresentation of the data. And yet these two authors here repeat the exact same error again. I don't need to talk about this example anymore because it's been talked about so many times, and a quick Google search will lead you to several articles about that. Maybe I'll put a couple at the bottom of this video. And then last but not least, I almost had to laugh when I saw this article from Answers in Genesis. What are the dangers of quote mining? And of course, Earth creationists are kind of renowned for their quote mining capacities, right? The ability to go in to an article or somebody and pull out one sentence, and then insert it into one of their articles, which makes it sound like that author is suggesting one thing when they're not, right? I mean, that's the idea of quote mining. Now, to their credit, they published this article on their site, and this is actually an old article. I had seen it before, but they republished it on November 28th, by an author that I think he's only published one or two articles there. And the article actually is aimed not at secular scientists, it's aimed at other creationists. And it's reminding them that they need to be better at not quote mining. And so I will applaud Answers in Genesis for once again reminding themselves, that they need to be more careful with the quote mining. I don't see that it's actually changed their behavior since, 2017, when that article was first published. But there's actually some very good reminders in there about what quote mining is and how to be careful not to use it. And the author's absolutely right. When you do really egregious quote mining, it reflects poorly, all right, on Christians. It's not a good Christian witness to quote mine in such a fashion, because it is effectively a form of lying, and it's really not excusable. All right, and Christians should be more cognizant of how they communicate to people in a truthful manner. And I just wish Answers in Genesis and other creationists would be a little more mindful of this. Well, that's it for this week. I've I've definitely talked a little bit too much. I'm trying to keep it under 30 minutes, and I'm not sure I've been successful. So maybe I'll be able to edit a few things out when I go back through this. But if you've made it this far, thanks for taking this trip with me through this week in creationism, episode number 15. And check out my writing on thenaturalhistorian.com and subscribe to my channel here. Thanks a lot. We'll talk to you later. Bye bye.